related to trauma. Thank you very much, Amantha.
Thank you, Cait. Just a quick clarification. I won't be talking too much about trolling. I would probably be paying more attention to online trauma threats, because my colleague Ginger, who follows me, would be focusing more on trolling. Next slide, please, Cait. Next slide. So the idea of online trauma threats is the online psychological dangers to our mental safety that we face. Now, what I want to emphasize here is that these are not new threats. These are threats that have been there in the past and that we have recognized them in the past as well. But what has happened in the past 1 year to 10 months is that due to the changes in the way that we work, in the way we live, that has taken place due to the pandemic, the nature of the exposure to online trauma threats has changed quite dramatically. Another change has been the dynamics of these threats have also changed quite a lot during the lockdowns. Now, these threats include abuse, doxing, trolling, content, including disturbing and fake content. And one example of how the dynamics and the exposure has changed is that a lot of journalists that we have spoken to in the past year or so have said that the type of trauma that they fear because of content that is either fake or that is misinformation has gone up. And also there is increase that we've seen in journalists fearing the type of threats that they face because of the content that they're dealing with. For example, we've seen that journalists who cover the story of the pandemic, who go out and report on this, get affected quite a bit by the type of stories that they work on, because the story does have a direct impact on their lives and the lives of their loved ones. Now, online trauma threats tend to be dialogic in nature, and they also tend to be quite personal. Now, that's because of the way we use online devices and how our online footprint is, because it's very difficult for most of us to differentiate between our personal and our professional personalities in the online world. And most of the time, these threats can feel unrelenting, and there appears to be no end to this. But they can be moderated and mitigated. And what these kind of webinars and this webinar is trying to do is to build that kind of skills among journalists, that they can face up to these threats and do their job much better than they did before. Next slide, please. So I am conducting an ongoing research into how online trauma threats have escalated in the last 10 to 12 months. So what the data so far has indicated is that there is a major shift online in terms of how journalists work online. It's not to say that journalists didn't work online or that they worked quite a bit online. But what we see now is that most of the journalists that I have spoken to say that about 80% say that online resources are their main resources for reporting, disseminating, and engagement tools. And also we see about 70% now spending about more than 5 hours a day online on their work. And this is not counting the time that they spend for their personal activities. And at the height of the lockdown, so this should be about from about May till about August of last year, they spent about 90% spent about 5 hours or more online a day. And before the lockdowns, they said that the number was about 40% who spent 5 hours or more online. And like I said, the awareness that fake news and disturbing information can have on their daily lives and the lives of their loved ones, those who they are closest to, is also rising. Uh, and what all these things, these trends indicate is that the digital dependence of journalism and journalists is going up, and it's not showing any signs of de-escalating anytime soon. And the trends are likely to remain at these levels for quite some time. But also, during the same time these changes were taking place, we have also seen that there is a heightened concern on personal safety, or including mental safety and self-care. More and more journalists are talking about the impact on their mental safety due to the type of work that they do online. They did speak about these issues before the lockdowns, before the pandemic, but they were more peripheral issues. So they would be aware of it, but they wouldn't, most of them wouldn't think that these were issues that affected them on a day-to-day basis. That has changed quite a bit right now. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the examples of what journalists have told me during the research. And you get the sense of isolation, uncertainty, anxiety quite a bit. And that is to be expected. But also you get this other sense that journalists do want to build up their skills in how to face up to these challenges and to do their job much better. And that's what basically what we're trying to do here, is to build these kind of skills. Now, I like to think of building skills to identify and mitigate online trauma threats as something akin to strength training. What we do is we build our strengths so that we can face up to these challenges much better, and also do our job better as journalists. Now, the first step in getting ourselves more skilled to be better equipped to face up to these threats is awareness, is to understand how these threats manifest, how they impact, and how we can mitigate them. And it's as the start for that process is as simple as starting a conversation on that. And that is the first step. The first step is being aware of these threats. And it's important to also understand that these threats do not remain static, that they are very dynamic. They change quickly. Their threat levels change quickly. And also, the way they impact can change not only from the general situation, but also from your personal situation. Now, that's one of the things that we need to be quite aware of, that the way online threats can impact journalists and anybody else depends quite a bit on the personal circumstances. Personal circumstances of where you work, how you work, and probably with whom you work. And in the past 10 months or so, we've seen the shift to remote working, and especially working from home environments, having positive and negative impacts. And in terms of news managers, I think the most important thing a news manager can do is to recognize the potency of online trauma threats. that these are really dangerous threats that have, and that will impact the personal and professional lives of their staff. Uh, and also to consider these threats as core psychosocial safety concerns. As much as we would talk about the physical safety of journalists who go out to report, we need to talk about the mental safety of journalists. Journalism is a job that's very exciting. It's a job that brings in so much of excitement and fulfillment, but it's also a career where we cannot stay away from issues that are nasty, that are uncomfortable. And we need to be equipped to face up to these issues and to do our job in a much more professional, in a much more skilled manner. And lastly, I think in a newsroom setup, I think the most important thing to build the skills for journalists and the newsroom as a whole to face up to these threats is to recognize them as a threat and then start talking about them. Because if the conversations start at a manager level or at a newsroom leader level, it is much more formalized. It's not to say that individual journalists talking among each other is not important. It is important, but for that to come up to a much more formal level, it takes some time because it's starting at a much more impersonal, at a much more personal level. So, but if a news leader starts the conversation, it becomes much more formal and a topic that others will feel comfortable talking about.